How to Coup, narrated by Gabriel Ferguson. 1 Forward. A friend and I were on the train to Spitz discussing ideas for our Matura papers. I had just expressed my interest in examining coups and how they generally work. She was not entirely convinced at first, but then suggested that I could create a tutorial with easy-to-follow steps on how to lead a successful coup in today's world through the analysis of recent coup attempts. Although she might have meant it more as a joke at the time, I found the idea terrific. Furthermore, this topic allowed me to combine my love for historical analysis and current events. For that, I am grateful and thank my friend Antonia dearly. 2 Introduction. In the early morning of September 11th, 1973, the Chilean Navy blockaded the critical port of Valparaiso. The Army closed radio stations and television networks, while the Air Force bombed key targets in Santiago. With the fate of Chilean democracy at stake, elected socialist President Salvador Allende could do little other than barricade himself inside the presidential palace. As the military stormed the presidential palace and took control, Allende was found dead, allegedly having committed suicide. In only a few hours, the military under the leadership of the soon-to-be dictator and mass murderer General Augusto Pinochet seized power in Chile in a successful coup. 2.1. What is a coup? A brief definition. What is a coup? The Cambridge Dictionary defines a coup, also referred to as coup d'état, as a sudden and violent change in government. There is nothing wrong with this definition, it is factually correct. However, in practice, a coup can be much more than just sudden and violent change in government. Many coups go through detailed and rigorous planning and often results in political, economic, or other social change. There are also widespread implications that a coup or coup attempt can have on a nation or even a region. 2.2 Scope. In this paper, a robust definition of a coup has been formulated. Diving deeper into what it means to stage a coup, the paper examines the necessary preconditions, the various stages of planning, the execution of a coup, and both the short-term and long-term consequences. Utilizing the information gathered, a 10-step list has been created to explain how one would go about staging a coup. Using the definition of a coup and the 10-step list as a framework, 5 recent coup attempts are analyzed in detail, with each attempt deconstructed to assess what went wrong, what went right, and overall, whether the attempt was successful or not. The 5 recent coup attempts that are analyzed in detail are as follows. Russia, June 23, 2023. Niger, July 26, 2023. Sudan, April 15, 2023. Myanmar, February 1, 2021. United States of America, January 6, 2021. 2.3. Approach. Most of the information regarding the definition of a coup and the material that shapes the ideas behind the 10-step list comes from the book Coup d'État, a practical handbook, revised edition, written by Edward N. Lutwak. The book provides a brilliant perspective on what it means to stage a successful coup. The applicable chapters of this book are summarized and condensed in a way that is relevant to this paper, leading to the formulation of the 10-step list. Following the definition of the 10-step list, the global and regional trends of coups are explored using an excellent database by the University of Illinois as the primary source. Due to the journalistic nature of this paper, many internet sources regarding current events were consulted to summarize the events of each of the coup attempts listed above. These summaries formed the basis for the detailed analysis of each coup, setting the 10-step list against the various stages of a coup attempt to judge how successful it was. The paper concludes with some words about the impacts of coup attempts and their prevention. 3. What is a coup? Lutwak defines a coup d'état as follows. A coup consists of the infiltration of a small but critical segment of the state apparatus, which is then used to displace the government from its control of the remainder. Unpacking this statement reveals various critical aspects of a coup. The state apparatus plays a crucial role in any coup, as it deeply relies on the bureaucracy of the modern state. Modern states depend on large and, more or less, sophisticated systems to organize themselves. They utilize extensive archives and records, and officials to control the activities of individuals and organizations. Such extensive bureaucracies are necessary for nearly all aspects of government function, from defense and security to civil services, each with its officers, and rigid bureaucratic systems. A coup typically does not aim to completely uproot the current system. Instead, it exploits the state bureaucracy both during and after the takeover. It is important to distinguish between a coup, a revolution, and other forms of unrest. Revolution. A classic revolution is characterized as being conducted by a largely uncoordinated popular mass that aims to change social and political structures. In so doing, it also redefines leadership positions in the state. Civil war. Civil war means outright warfare between two parties of the same country, typically between branches of the armed services and involving the entire population at large. Civil war is never good for a country and results in an undesirable outcome for both parties. A failed or only partially successful coup can result in civil war. Pronunciamiento. A pronunciamiento is essentially a Spanish and Latin American version of the coup d'état. Initially, it was more of a liberal concept with the idea of national will at the core of the takeover. Over time, however, the focus has shifted more towards simply consolidating power. Unlike a typical coup, which may be led by a faction within the armed forces, a pronunciamiento is characteristically led by the entire armed forces. Liberation. Liberation is when a foreign army overthrows a government claiming to liberate its people. While the term liberation is used by the initiators, the term regime change is often more appropriate. A classic example is the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Putsch. A putsch is like the pronunciamiento, however, with some key differences. A putsch only occurs during wartime or shortly after the war has ended and is attempted by a formal body within the armed forces while having a clear and structured leadership. War of national liberation or insurgency. This is a type of internal conflict where the goal of the initiating party is not to seize power in the current system, but rather to create a rival state structure eventually replacing the current system. It is often initiated by an ethnic group in a country. The Kurds of Iraq and Iran or the Taliban in Afghanistan are a good example of this. A coup d'état incorporates various elements of the above methods of seizing power. However, unlike many of these methods, a coup typically does not involve mass public participation or large-scale military combat. Another important distinction of a coup is that it does not hinge on a specific political orientation, unlike revolutions that are typically leftist, or the pronunciamientos that are often initiated by right-wing sympathizers. 3.1. A short history of coups. Since 1945, there have been 997 coup attempts and coup conspiracies, 443 of which were successful. This increase of coup attempts has a lot to do with the establishment of the modern state, even if the term coup d'état has been known and used for the past 3 centuries. One of the earliest examples of a modern coup occurred on November 9, 1799, when Napoleon consolidated power for himself by overthrowing the French Directory and dissolving its parliament, thereby ending the Second French Republic. Since then, coups have become a common occurrence. Many regions in Latin America experienced frequent coups during the 19th and 20th centuries. Similarly, Africa is today the continent most frequently affected by coups, as can be seen in the graph above, which clearly shows the region of sub-Saharan Africa as the most plagued by coups over the last 30 years. This is largely due to the instability caused by colonization and subsequent decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s, which left regions vulnerable. It is no secret that the increased number of coup attempts is tightly linked with the United States, the CIA, and its involvement in foreign nations. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the United States intervened in numerous foreign governments deemed unfriendly to American interests. They often did this by staging a coup, e.g., Chile 1973, providing financial aid to opposition groups, e.g. Iran 1953, or outright invading the country to enact regime change under the guise of liberating the people, e.g. Iraq 2003. This heightened US involvement in matters of foreign policy is a direct result of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, while often succeeding in deposing the targeted regime, the affected nations often consequently found themselves in the hands of brutal military dictators or in the middle of civil unrest. The legacy of these US-backed coups remains a point of contention, with some arguing they served American strategic interests, while others criticized the human rights abuses and political instability that often followed. 3.2. When is a coup possible? If you were to go to the Bundeshaus, arrest the Bundesrat, and declare yourself Bundesrat president for life, you'd meet some resistance, end up dead, or otherwise face a lengthy prison term. This scenario is unthinkable and rather ridiculous, because Switzerland is not a good country in which to start a coup. Naturally, not all countries are ideal for a coup. The chances of a coup being successful are largely dependent on one or more of these three preconditions. 1. The country must be very poor and unequal, with only a few wealthy people having a say in government. 2. The country can't be controlled or heavily influenced by another powerful nation and should make its own decisions about who leads. 3. The target country should have a clear political center, and if it has multiple centers, they must be political and identifiable. A coup is only possible with the approval or neutrality of any controlling non-political groups. 3.2.1. Economic backwardness. Luttwak describes the first precondition to a coup as economic backwardness, while stating the following. In countries without a developed economy and the prosperity that accompanies it, the general condition of the population is characterized by disease, illiteracy, high birth rates, and periodic hunger. One key reason for why a coup attempt in Switzerland would see little success is the fact that most people have a deep understanding of the political system and are active participants. In countries where most citizens are preoccupied with basic necessities, such as food, water, and shelter, rather than electing the next governing body, conditions are ideal for launching a coup. In economically backward countries, the relationship between the people and the political leadership is often one way only, meaning that the leadership speaks to the people, tells them what to do, what to think, but rarely listens nor gives much in return. This lack of dialogue is crucial for the success of a coup and hinges on the absence of reaction by much of the population, unlike the unpredictable, spontaneous, and large reaction that would take place in economically developed countries. The small number of educated elites who possess both the understanding and the socio-economic status to oppose a coup can easily be neutralized by either recruiting them or dispatching the opposition. Nevertheless, opponents of the coup will have no choice but to oppose the coup as political rivals, making them clearly identifiable. The disinterest and lack of reaction by most of the population is what allows the coup plotters to stay in power. Coups can only have a chance of succeeding in developed nations if one of the following factors is present. A. Prolonged economic crisis. B. Chronic political instability. C. Unsuccessful war or major defeat. 3.2.2. Political independence. It is impossible to attempt a coup when most of the political influence is held by a foreign power, thereby making it unable to be seized. Naturally, nations will mostly be tied to foreign powers in some way, be that through trade, alliances, or other forms of cooperation. But at what point does such a dependency affect the feasibility of a coup? Luttwak uses the relationship between Egypt and the Soviet Union from 1955 to 1967 as an example of what overdependency looks like. The Czech arms deal in 1955 was the first formal arms supply contract between the two states. It had two side effects. On the one hand, it solidified Egyptian independence by breaking away from the West, while on the other hand, it started a new commitment to the USSR. From 1956 to 1962, this commitment was increased by the fact that Egypt suffered a defeat in the Suez-Sinai War, as well as a revolution and civil war in Yemen, leading to the loss of much equipment that was replaced by the USSR increasing financial debt. The United States, growing increasingly frustrated with Egyptian and Soviet collaboration, cut off wheat shipments to Egypt. As food shortages worsened, food aid provided by the USSR became necessary, further escalating both the financial and moral indebtedness to the USSR. Finally, the June 1967 Six-Day War, involving a united force of Arab states including Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria against Israel, resulted in an overwhelming defeat for the Arab coalition and the loss of approximately 80% of Egypt's military equipment. This military disaster forced Egypt to ask the USSR to re-equip its armed forces. However, the conditions of Egyptian re-equipment were that the USSR required close supervision of training, a say in choosing military personnel, as well as demanding a reorganization of intelligence agencies. Essentially, Egypt traded its dependency on the West for an even greater dependency on the Soviet Union. In such cases, coup plotters must include post-coup foreign policy in their plan to seize power. If not, the foreign power at the minimum will act as a stage for counter-coup activities. 3.2.3 Unity. Another potential obstacle to a coup is when political power is not concentrated in one place. The consequences of economic backwardness will often lead to power being concentrated among a small number of elites. However, other influential groups can act as de facto government, or at least have a large amount of influence. Here, we can distinguish between sectional interests and regional entities. A sectional interest often takes the form of a global megacorporation whose sole goal is to extract whatever resources it seeks while preserving the status quo. In some cases, these corporations have more influence than the governments themselves, as they own most of the land and employ much of the population. Due to the underdevelopment of these regions, governments might even depend on these corporations for transport, communication, and other infrastructure services. Ironically, the most likely contender to plot a coup in such a country is often the corporation itself. An example of a corporation having more power than the government is the United Fruit Company. During the second half of the 20th century, the United Fruit Company exercised its power over the governments of various Central American states, such as Honduras. The company went as far as maintaining private armed forces and overthrowing governments with the endorsement and assistance of the US. This example illustrates why a coup in such an environment would have little chance of success if not conducted by the company. If a powerful non-governmental force is present, this force will be more interested in maintaining the status quo rather than endorsing a potentially destabilizing coup. Regional entities can also stand in the way of a successful coup. The challenge with regional entities lies in their leadership being based on ethnic ties rather than political ideologies, making them hard to infiltrate for an outsider. If a regional entity has enough or even more political power than the actual political center, a coup may be impossible unless the coup plotters either seek the approval or neutrality of the regional entity. The Arab world is a prime example of how regional entities can wield significant influence due to religious diversity, such as the divisions between Sunni and Shia Muslims. 3.3 Strategy of a coup. Overthrowing a government is difficult. The government has its professional bureaucracy and defense capabilities to rely on. Additionally, there are usually some groups that support the status quo. The unique thing about a coup is that plotters do not want to completely uproot the system, unlike in a revolution as discussed in Chapter 3, but use the current one to seize power and displace the ruling body. To achieve success, coup plotters must fully eliminate their enemies, not only immediately after, but more importantly, before the coup. In this transitional phase from one governing body to another, speed is a vital element. Coups are executed not in days or weeks, but within hours. Neutralizing all opposition before the coup even begins is invaluable to its success. The strategy of a coup hinges on the neutralization of three key areas of government that could intervene against it. Plotters must eliminate these forces capable of intervention, no matter how small they are. 3.3.1 Armed Forces. The armed forces can be both an obstacle and a massive opportunity for coup plotters. On the one hand, they may present the greatest resistance. On the other, they are an excellent source for recruiting personnel to carry out the coup. The key now is to identify which part of the armed forces is relevant to the coup. In most cases, the army will be the most important factor, as the coup is unlikely to involve extensive naval or aerial activity. In particular, the use of Air Force bombings is not ideal and counterproductive, as bombing one's own capital city is not bound to inspire confidence in the new government. However, in certain geographical settings, the other branches of the armed forces might become more useful. Next, plotters need to consider the location of military units. Forces relevant to the coup are those within 12 to 24 hours of the staging point, usually the capital city, as they could intervene. Only after identifying these forces should the process of recruitment begin. Approaching the first recruits is the single riskiest moment in a coup attempt. Lutwak claims that the best units to incorporate are ones that have a simple organization and command structure. The leaders of those units are to be recruited unless there is a considerable political divide between the leadership and troops, in which case units can be incorporated without any cooperation of leadership. This can lead to a snowball effect, where the more personnel that are recruited, the more are likely to follow. Having the family and career history, political affiliations, and other information will help greatly in judging who is ideal for recruitment. Subtlety is paramount when approaching potential recruits, as they may naturally be suspicious of the plotters, fearing that they could be agents of the security forces aiming to catch coup plotters. Strategies for recruitment can include appealing to ideas of restoring national glory, invoking nostalgia for the good old times, and targeting personnel with similar political opinions or ethnic backgrounds as the coup plotters. Telling recruits that their superiors are already part of the plot is also a good strategy, which with time will have the added benefit of being true. Over-recruitment is to be avoided, as the more people that know about the plot, the more the overall security level is reduced. Once a recruit has accepted the idea of a coup, their role within it should be explained in detail while avoiding mentioning anything that does not involve their specific task. During the early stages of a coup, the plotter's greatest advantage is their knowledge of the establishment and the establishment's lack of information about them. All information must be kept on a need-to-know basis. 3.3.2 Police. The police of a country is shaped by local, social, and political standards and are as a result very diverse. Generally, there will be three types of police forces that coup plotters will have to deal with: paramilitary police, rural police, urban, and national police. Police forces can be dealt with in a similar manner as the armed forces, whereby they must be analyzed in detail to determine which forces could potentially halt a coup attempt. The ones that pose no danger can be largely ignored. The rural police, for example, are unlikely to put up a fight against highly trained soldiers that were recruited onto the side of the coup. Rural police forces are also a lot more spread out and are less likely come to the government's aid in a faraway capital city to help intervene against a coup. The urban and national police forces will prove more challenging as they are often stationed in or near the capital city. In such cases, it is crucial to assess the police unit's loyalties to the current regime. If a divide between the police force and the government is observed, recruiting the unit could be a possibility. However, recruiting urban and national police forces is more difficult, since police officers are more integrated into society and can significantly impact security. If plotters can demonstrate overwhelming firepower, an urban or national police force might not resist. This scenario is ideal, as it is important to note that for a coup to be successful, it must involve little to no active combat. Paramilitary police can present a significant obstacle, as they function both as a military and police force. This means that paramilitary police units can be as large or even larger than many military units. In addition, paramilitary police will be equipped with professional training and advanced weaponry, such as automatic weapons and armored vehicles. If not addressed properly, paramilitary police can cause a coup to fail. If the paramilitary police is larger than the incorporated armed forces, the entire recruitment process must be repeated to try to incorporate as much of the paramilitary police as possible. Moreover, the loyalty of the paramilitary police to the current regime must be carefully analyzed. Lutwak notes that he has been unable to find a single case in the last 20 years where a paramilitary police force has actually defended its political masters during a coup. 3.3.3 Security Forces. Numerically, the security forces will be the smallest, but pose the most danger. They are not well defined and often very loyal to the current regime. When dealing with the security forces, a plotter's first step, therefore, is to identify the different security agencies more precisely. Some branches of the security forces will prove irrelevant, but others will be actively looking for coup plotters. From the point of view of the plotters, the most important security forces are those concerned with counterintelligence and internal political security. These forces are to be avoided as much as possible. 3.4. Planning of a coup. As the coup approaches execution, plotters must gain a deep understanding of the dynamics involved. Poor planning can have an enormously detrimental effect on the outcome of a coup and may ultimately lead to its failure. During the planning process, plotters must consider every potential obstacle and devise viable solutions to these challenges. Obstacles don't only include armed governmental forces, as discussed in Chapter 3.3, but also civilian groups and political forces. Direct political power is focused within the current government. However, in almost all countries, there will be some other groups that have political power or that can significantly influence political life. This creates an element of unpredictability that must be avoided. The worst outcome for coup plotters is to technically seize power, only to find they have no real control, leading to their prompt arresting and ousting in a counter-coup or worse, the attempt devolving into a civil war. It is therefore vital to come up with a plan on how to neutralize political forces during the attempt. In general, coup plotters will need to establish control over the following factors: current government personalities, physical facilities, religious organizations, political parties, trade unions. The main priority will be to take control of the current government. Here, we can focus mostly on the prominent personalities of government. This includes the President, Prime Minister, the Ministers of Defense and Interior, party leaders, and other high-ranking government officials. They will all need to be promptly arrested. Depending on the complexity of the state, there will be many separate targets. Ideally, separate trusted teams will focus on simultaneously arresting these figures during the execution of the coup. As tempting as it may seem, significant bloodshed is to be avoided, as killing political leaders will be unpopular with the public, and keeping political leaders can be used to establish legitimacy. A typical government structure and its hierarchy is depicted in the diagram below. Creating a diagram of the current government structure is beneficial. It serves as a tool not only for understanding how the government operates, but also for classifying the personalities within the pre-coup regime and determining who should be arrested and who can be left alone. Classification of government personalities falls into three categories: leadership and those in charge of enforcement. This group must be arrested and isolated for the duration of the coup. It should include any government leader, such as the president or other leading figure, along with the most important ministers as indicated in the figure above. These key officials must be arrested to prevent them from coordinating any resistance. Other ministers and civil servants. This group is less important and should be subdivided into priority groups. Those that could pose a threat should be promptly arrested. Positions such as the ministers of health and social welfare are not an immediate concern for plotters. However, others, such as the minister of education, who could, for example, coordinate a student militia, could be vital for securing power. Ceremonial figures. these individuals should not be arrested. If the target country has a ceremonial head of state, such as the UK's king or Japan's emperor, these figures should be ignored. In fact, ceremonial leaders can benefit plotters in the long term, as they might help establish legitimacy and serve as symbols of continuity. Next, plotters need to consider securing physical facilities. This includes media and radio stations, city entry and exit points, key traffic junctions, airports, other critical transportation infrastructure, and public buildings. Securing the media outlets will be the most important, as stated by Lutwak. Control over the mass media emanating from the political center will still be our most important weapon in establishing our authority after the coup. The goal is to monopolize the flow of information, for which plotters must seek to control every single media outlet. This, however, is nearly impossible, as even largely backward countries often have several media outlets, too many to secure individually. The strategy will therefore be to establish control over the media outlet that is most associated with the voice of authority, and that most of the population trust for information while at the same time sabotaging others. For example, if one were to stage a coup in Switzerland, plotters would need to focus on taking control of the SRF broadcasting services while eliminating other stations such as Radio BEO. The key should be to deny the opposition from communicating with the public and with each other. This includes temporarily sabotaging dedicated communication networks, such as phone lines and internet. During the execution of a coup, even a small, unexpected arrival of opposition troops can pose serious danger. Since the staging ground for a coup is often the capital city, it is crucial to secure it so that no one enters or leaves. This can be achieved by establishing simple, effective roadblocks at key, exit, and entry points. If the target country has a coastal capital, this is ideal, as the ocean creates a natural barrier. All means of entering and exiting the staging point of the coup must be eliminated. Once roadblocks are established at key points, the remaining threats are usually airports and railways. Both can be easily neutralized. Airports can be made unusable for the opposition by simply parking guarded armored vehicles on the runway, instantly preventing planes from taking off or landing. Railways are even easier to disable since they run on fixed tracks. Destroying a section of the track can cripple the entire rail system. Arresting individuals who might call for reinforcements or disrupting the communication systems they would use to summon help can further secure the capital. Additionally, plotters will want to establish a physical presence in the capital to assert their authority. This could take the form of simply parking tanks with armed guards at key traffic points and monuments throughout the city. Public buildings are also important targets. These can be reduced to securing the places associated with political power. Public buildings that should be targeted include the following: place of effective political power, vital administrative buildings, symbolic buildings, headquarters of the police, army, and security forces. Religious organizations can sometimes pose a challenge. In economically developed nations, religious organizations no longer wield political power and can largely be ignored. However, in economically backward countries, religions organizations still hold a considerable influence. No matter the religion, arresting the leader of the religious organization is not a good idea, as this will probably be very unpopular with the public, even more so than direct leaders. If the religious leader is also the lead decision maker, then plotters will be forced to arrest him or her. If the religious leader only plays the role of preacher, he or she should not be arrested. Finally, plotters will have to deal with both political parties and trade unions. In addition to having significant political power, trade unions are particularly challenging, as they can bring a country's economy to halt and actively mount resistance to the coup. If they pose a threat, their leaders should be arrested and their headquarters shut down. Political parties, depending on type and function, can generally be classified as lesser threats. Naturally, the top members of the ruling party should be arrested. It should also be considered that political parties may be direct competitors for plotters with the capacity to mount a particularly prompt response. 3.5. Execution of a coup. After months of rigorous planning, observing, and recruiting, it is finally time to set plans into motion. The active stage of a coup is the shortest, but the most decisive. In essence, a coup is not dissimilar from a conventional military operation, the main differences being that speed is an absolute necessity, not just favorable, and unlike in a military operation, there is no chance to regroup, hold back troops, or drastically rethink strategic elements. It is all or nothing. At this stage, the coup is considered active. Within a few critical hours, the plotters and their forces will attempt to decisively seize and hold power in the capital city, thereby largely neutralizing the influence of forces outside the capital. The roughly 12 to 24-hour period before the coup is the most unstable and dangerous in terms of security, as plotters must begin issuing precise orders related to the execution of the coup. This increases the risk of detection, particularly as security forces might have picked up on suspicious activities or even infiltrated the coup forces to some extent. The coup will be executed not by one large fighting force, but by several smaller teams, each with its own objectives and precise orders. These teams will not communicate directly with each other. Instead, all communication between teams will occur exclusively through the main plotters. This approach has two benefits. On the one hand, it ensures that no element within the coup forces will be tempted to seize control by themselves, creating a coup within the coup. On the other hand, it somewhat moderates the security issues previously mentioned, as all communications are channeled through the main plotters. 0 hour is the moment when plotters officially start assuming control by securing various positions. However, before this can occur, the coup plotters' forces must be in position at various points at the same time. To achieve this, the previously mentioned teams will be deployed. Each team will be sent out separately to secure targets, as illustrated by Lutwak in the figure below. The figure illustrates the importance of executing the coup in various phases. Different targets require different teams at different locations at different times. It is impractical to deploy team number 5 to seize its target simultaneously with team number 1, as this approach wastes time and resources. For example, team number 1 might be assigned to set up remote roadblocks across the capital city, a task that consumes considerable time, while team number 5 could be tasked with securing unguarded public buildings, which takes considerably less time and resources. Hence, it would be redundant for team number 5 to act too far in advance. It is crucial to control the distribution of information and not give details until they are necessary. Each team should be allocated just enough time to reach and secure its target, so that by 0 hour, all targets are either seized or in the process of being seized. When it comes to the actual execution of the coup, Lutwak states that the coup will require many different qualities: skillful of-the-cuff diplomacy at a blocking position confronted by loyalist forces, instant personnel management at radio and television stations to persuade their technical staff to cooperate with us, and considerable tactical abilities in the case of targets that are heavily defended. Coup plotters should categorize their targets based on various factors to determine the necessary resource allocation. All targets can be classified into one of 3 categories. A targets. These are the most crucial and heavily protected targets, characterized by tight security and armed resistance. This category includes such targets as the Presidential Palace, Central Police Station, and Army Headquarters. Teams assigned to neutralize A targets will need to be numerically strong and well equipped, including armored personnel carriers or tanks if available. However, this could potentially pose the threat of a coup within the coup. To mitigate this risk, after the A targets have been neutralized, the larger teams will splinter into smaller groups to secure secondary targets, thereby preventing any larger cooperation between teams. This strategy ensures tighter control and minimizes the risk of internal power struggles. B targets. These targets typically include technical facilities like radio and television stations, which are not heavily defended. Teams assigned to neutralize B targets will consist of a small group of skilled personnel who are capable of operating technical facilities. These teams will be supported by a few lightly armed soldiers or police officers. C targets. C targets are individuals previously designated for arrest, as these personalities will pose a threat and actively seek to undermine the coup attempt. Therefore, it is crucial to devote considerable early attention to these targets. Capturing C targets does not require a large force. Often, fewer than a dozen well-armed personnel are sufficient to arrest one individual, even if it involves neutralizing one or two armed guards or security staff. When all objectives have been seized, it is time for the coup plotter to announce the coup via the seized radio television station. In this speech, the following points should be made. A. Plotters aim to establish stability. There should be no doubt that the coup is over and that the plotters are now in charge. Asserting the plotters' absolute authority and clearly stating that any resistance will be met with swift retaliation is essential. B. Associate the new leadership with symbols of national pride and unity. C. Don't use the word coup. Avoid using political jargon to appeal to as broad of an audience as possible. D. Debunk any claims that the coup was funded by a foreign power, even if that may well have been the case. E. If there is remaining resistance, it should be acknowledged and downplayed. This addressing of the nation serves one main purpose: securing public order in the short term, so that in the long term, the public can be controlled without use of extensive physical force. This marks the end of the active stage of the coup. 3.6 Post-coup strategy. With power now seized, the plotters face the real challenge: maintaining control and effectively managing the post-coup situation. Before and during the coup, the plotters aim to destabilize the country as much as possible. However, now, their focus must shift towards stabilizing the situation among three main groups, and thereby the country at large. These groups are the plotters' own forces, the bureaucracy, and the public. Dealing with the plotters' own forces is relatively straightforward, as Luttwak points out. As soon as our position has been established, our best policy may be to dispose of our dangerous allies by using the usual methods available for the purpose: diplomatic posting abroad, nominal and/or remote command positions, and promotions to less vital parts of the state apparatus. The bureaucracy is the hardest to deal with, as they are both immensely important and numerically large. Generally, bureaucrats are more concerned with keeping their jobs than standing up against the new regime. For this reason, the bureaucracy should be plotters' first focus to re-establish order and security. The public may not possess military or administrative power, but their attitude toward an acceptance of the coup will ultimately determine its fate. Initially, implementing a curfew, suspending all public transport, closing public buildings, and interrupting communication networks will help prevent any popular uprising. The first step is for the population to accept the reality of the coup, rather than having plotters justify it. This is achieved by emphasizing that law and order have been restored and all resistance has been crushed. Next, the plotters should consider announcing populist reforms to win over the people, such as food aid for the poor and social justice initiatives. Effective propaganda and police measures should also be used to influence and deter any dissident activities. Over time, most of the population will likely come to accept the new reality or even outright support the coup. Now that the plotters have seized control, they must confront the statistical reality that being in charge significantly increases the chances of them being targeted by a coup themselves. This phenomenon is known as the coup trap. By successfully executing a coup, the plotters have set a precedent that coups are possible, thereby making it more likely that others will attempt similar actions in the future. Most regimes that begin with a military coup have limited longevity. The number of leaders who have been able to sustain multi-decade rule following a coup is much lower than the total number of successful coup attempts. In my opinion, plotters have two options when it comes to long-term survival in the post-coup world they have created. Take the money and run. As mentioned, coup regimes are not known for their longevity. Therefore, it is a strategy for some plotters to take a selfish route by setting up shell companies in tax havens, transferring ownership of natural resource extraction companies to close relatives, and rule for a few years while embezzling as many state funds as possible. This deliberate accumulation of wealth enables plotters to retire in luxury and live out the rest of their lives in comfort. An example of this strategy in action is the case of Jean-Claude Duvalier in Haiti. He assumed control of Haiti after the death of his father in 1971 until he was ousted and fled the country. During his regime, he embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars from the Haitian treasury, accumulating vast personal wealth while the country remained impoverished. After his exile, he lived in luxury in France, having taken a substantial portion of Haiti's wealth with him. Transition to democracy. One way to avoid the coup trap is to subtly transition from a military dictatorship to a democracy. It is particularly effective if the coup plotters are subsequently elected as leaders, which clearly legitimizes their authority. However, this approach is challenging and requires extensive election and propaganda campaigns and international endorsement, particularly American. Jerry Rawlings ousted the government in Ghana twice, first in 1979 and subsequently in 1981. After both coup attempts, he transitioned Ghana towards democracy. Following the second coup, which removed the civilian government he had previously installed, he again scheduled free and fair elections and won. After retiring, Rawlings enjoyed a comfortable life and held significant national respect up until his death in 2020. 4. How to coup. The 10 steps list. Now that a clear definition of a coup has been established, I will summarize the points into the 10-step list that is the essence of this paper. How to coup. This list does not provide detailed explanations on how to start and execute a coup, but rather serves to offer a basic understanding and overview of the topic. For detailed explanation, see Chapter 3. Step 1. Pick a country. The first step in staging a coup is selecting a suitable country. This is a critical step as the choice will significantly influence the outcome of the coup attempt. The first step is to ensure that the target country is economically backward, politically independent, and has a centralized political structure. Step 2. Study the state apparatus. Information is everything, and if utilized correctly, will greatly enhance the coup's chance of success. The second step, the most important step, is to identify key segments of the state bureaucracy, armed forces, security forces, and police. All information is invaluable, especially details regarding loyalty to the current regime, political power, firepower, and location. Step 3. Infiltrate the state apparatus. Using the knowledge gained from Step 2, the third step is to attempt to recruit or neutralize key segments of the state apparatus. Primarily focus on the armed forces, following by the security forces, police, and bureaucrats. To infiltrate these organizations, efforts should focus on recruiting segments with simple command structures and similar political or ethnic backgrounds, while also considering the location of the desired segment. Neutralize or avoid the most loyal units to the current regime. Step 4. Identify key facilities. The staging point of the coup will contain several key facilities. These facilities range from important government buildings, such as the Parliament and Presidential Palace, to entry and exit points and radio/TV stations. These must be identified, and a detailed plan regarding their importance, resource usage, and seizure must be formulated. Step 5. Identify prominent personalities. Everything and everyone that jeopardizes the success of the coup must be designated and neutralized. This can be by recruitment, isolation, imprisonment, or sometimes, while undesirable, outright murder. Key players should be categorized and studied in order to neutralize them efficiently. Step 6. Final preparations. About 24 hours before the active stage of the coup begins, it is time to start issuing precise orders to personnel and creating specialized teams, each with a specific task, one for the radio/TV station, one to secure the presidential palace, one to arrest prominent personalities, etc. Keep communication between teams to a minimum and provide only the most vital information. Step 7. Implement 0 hour. It's showtime. The coup is now active. Coordinate the coup's execution by deploying multiple teams with specific objectives as defined in Step 6. Ensure all teams are in position and act in a coordinated manner to secure targets within a short time frame. This means that not all teams are to be deployed at the same time, but must arrive and seize their designated target at the relevant delta to 0 hour. Step 8. Control communication. Utilize the seized media to announce the coup, emphasizing stability, national pride, and the legitimacy of the new regime. If possible, use ceremonial figures to further legitimize the new regime by securing their endorsement, either willingly or at gunpoint. Step 9. Stabilize the post-coup situation. To secure short-term stability, establish control over the plotters' own forces, the bureaucracy, and the public. Implement curfews, secure transportation, and suspend communication networks. Introduce populist reforms and use propaganda to gain public support and maintain order. Step 10. Contemplate long-term strategy. Power doesn't last forever, especially in a country susceptible to coups. Apart from a couple exceptions, the chances are high that the new regime won't last long. The long-term strategy can take two routes: either slowly transition to a democracy and ultimately legitimize the new regime, or embezzle as many state funds as possible and flee the country. 5. Regional trends. As briefly touched upon in Chapter 3.1, coups are a global phenomenon. The world map below highlights the frequency of coups in each country since 1945. The world map reveals stark regional trends and shows that coups are a global occurrence. The map categorizes countries based on the number of attempted coups they have experienced since 1950. The regions that suffer least from coups are Europe, North America, and Central Asia. In contrast, the regions more prone to coup attempts are Latin America, East Asia, and the Middle East. However, by far the most coup-prone region, especially in recent times, is Africa, in particular Sub-Saharan Africa. A comprehensive list, including other graphics, can be found in Appendix A. Analyzing current and past geopolitical events usually provides understanding as to why these regions are particularly affected by coups. In the case of Africa, for example, rapid, uncoordinated, and sometimes violent decolonialization created a lingering power vacuum which, combined with the backward nature of these countries, as described in Chapter 3.2.1, rampant corruption and frequent warfare, together create a perfect environment for coups to flourish. East Asia suffers from coups for similar reasons. The Middle East presents a somewhat different story, with decolonization playing a major role, alongside factors such as warfare, foreign involvement, and religion. Latin America is a case by itself, with many of its coup attempts occurring during the Cold War era, often with substantial involvement by the US. US involvement in coups cannot be understated, as put by Kinzer. The invasion of Iraq was not an isolated episode. It was the culmination of a 110-year period, during which Americans overthrew 14 governments that displeased them for various ideological, political, and economic reasons. However, due to the complicated and extensive nature of these events, this paper will not specifically cover the role of the United States in recent coup attempts. 6. Analysis of 5 recent coups. There have been several coups in the last 5 years, particularly in Africa. Providing an exact number of coups is difficult due to the way coups are defined, tracked, and reported on. Some coup attempts can clearly be labeled as coups, while others fall inside a grey area. While it is difficult to determine the exact number of coups that have taken place since 2019, the number is estimated at around 30 to 35 since 2019. 5 of these will be analysed in the following chapters. 6.1. Russia. On June 23, 2023, the Russian mercenary group Wagner turned its attention away from the ongoing war in Ukraine and instead set its sights on Moscow. In so doing, the group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, created the single biggest threat to Vladimir Putin's 24-year period of authority. The active stage of the coup attempt unfolded rapidly over 2 days in June 2023. However, this coup had been brewing for some months. Starting in January, Prigozhin openly criticized the Russian military's slow progress in Ukraine. Additionally, he accused the Russian government of inadequately supplying Wagner troops in an emphatic video posted to social media. Disgruntlement grew further among the Wagner group over the coming months as Prigozhin claimed that the military bureaucracy was obstructing Wagner's operations by cutting off communication lines and failing to deliver promised supplies. Finally, alleged attacks by Russian government troops on Wagner camps was the breaking point, as Prigozhin's frustration peaked. On June 23, 2023, he announced a march of justice towards Moscow. On June 24, 2023, Wagner forces captured the city of Rostov-on-Don, a key city and military hub. Wagner troops were seen taking tactical positions in the city and capturing Russian forces. Videos and reports on social media showed the Wagner group moving in armored columns towards Moscow while repelling Russian aerial attacks. Meanwhile, Putin addressed the nation, condemning Wagner's action as treason. However, the coup attempt didn't progress further as Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko brokered a deal between Wagner and the Russian government, leading Prigozhin to halt his advance and withdraw his forces. 2 months after the failed Wagner coup, Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash. If anything, this coup attempt illustrates what not to do. Analyzing the events that transpired from January to June against the 10-step list, it becomes clear that the attempt was fundamentally flawed. Problems already arise at step 1. While Russia does have a centralized political structure and is politically independent, it is not economically backward. Russia poses an additional challenge due to its vast size. Even if Wagner had managed to reach Moscow and depose Putin, there would likely have been significant resistance in other parts of Russia. Russia is simply not an ideal target for a coup. Step 2 was executed well by Prigozhin as he had significant information on the Russian military and political landscape due to his position and connections. Step 3, on the other hand, was not executed well. There are no reports of Prigozhin attempting to infiltrate segments of the Russian military or security forces, leading to a lack of broader military support. This was a critical failure. The shortcomings continue in Step 4. While Prigozhin did seize Rostov-on-Don and advance towards Moscow, Wagner were unable to take control of critical communication and government centers in Moscow. Step 5 was partially fulfilled. Prigozhin did target high-profile leaders such as Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, Valery Gerasimov, Chief of the General Staff, and Putin himself, but did not effectively neutralize or recruit them, leading to strong opposition from these figures. Overall, the whole preparation of the coup seemed rushed. There is nothing to suggest that Prigozhin had formulated a long-term plan on what to do if he had managed to push all the way to Moscow. The initial stages in Rostov-on-Don were executed swiftly, but as forces advanced, the lack of broader support and coordination from other critical segments became apparent. Above all, the coup lacked the element of surprise. Prigozhin posted many videos to social media where he openly aired his distrust and frustration of the Russian government, meaning that to the Russian security forces, such as the FSB, a coup attempt by Prigozhin was likely anticipated and prepared for. These factors invalidate steps 8, 9, and 10, as they never had a chance to be implemented. In summary, Prigozhin's coup attempt against the Russian government highlighted several critical missteps. Despite initial successes, such as the capture of Rostov-on-Don, the operation ultimately failed due to a lack of broader military support, inadequate infiltration of key segments, and a lack of the surprise element. Prigozhin's public criticisms and lack of a long-term plan further undermined the effort, leading to its ultimate failure. 6.2. Niger is one of those sub-Saharan countries most prone to coups. Since its independence from France in 1960, the country has experienced 11 coups, all of which were led by military juntas. Unlike the lackluster Russian attempt described in Chapter 6.1, this coup is a masterclass in how to correctly execute a coup. On the morning of July 26, 2023, the Presidential Guard turned on Bazoum, surrounding the presidential palace in Niamey, the capital of Niger. Led by the leader of the Presidential Guard, General Abdurrahmane Chiani, the presidential palace was stormed and Bazoum was detained. By midday, the presidential palace was blocked from receiving further support by military blockades. That same evening, Colonel Major Amadou Abdrahmane announced on state television that Bazoum had been removed, the constitution had been suspended, and borders had been closed. In addition, Abdrahmane emphasized that Bazoum had been removed out of necessity, noting the continuing deterioration of the security situation and poor economic and social governance. The following day, the armed forces of Niger declared their support for the coup, while violent demonstrations erupted both in favor of and against the coup. On July 28, 2023, General Chiani declared himself the head of the newly formed National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. Over the coming month, the military junta announced a new government, and Chiani promised to transition back to civilian rule within 3 years. Even though Abdrahmane attempted to reassure the international community in the televised speech that physical and moral integrity would be respected according to the principles of human rights, the coup met widespread international condemnation. Demands among the international community included that of the U.S. Department of State asserting, "The United States reiterates its call for the release of Mohamed Bazoum, his family, and all those detained." Furthermore, Niger was excluded from the ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. The organization demanded the release and reinstatement of Bazoum, sanctioning Niger and pledging military action if their demands were not met. In response, Niger and its allies Mali and Burkina Faso, which are also ruled by coup governments, remained firm and vowed to protect their national interests. As of this writing, the coup government in Niger is still in power. However, the situation remains tense. Comparing this coup attempt to the 10-step list, it is evident that many elements of the planning and execution were done successfully. Firstly, when it comes to choosing a suitable target, County Niger fits the bill perfectly as it has a centralized political structure, is politically independent yet unstable, and is sufficiently economically backward. The first step is therefore fulfilled. Next, the coup plotters, in particular General Chiani, would have had detailed knowledge of the Nigerian state's inner workings, including loyalties and strength of the military. This became apparent as the disloyal Presidential Guard turned on President Bazoum and the wider military joined the coup. The second step was thereby also executed well. The preparation in steps 3, 4, and 5 was also done well. The state apparatus was effectively and covertly infiltrated by Chiani's ability to recruit the Presidential Guard and later the entire military against Bazoum. Key facilities, such as the presidential palace and media stations, were swiftly targeted, secured, and blockaded to prevent external support. Prominent figures were also rapidly identified and immediately arrested. When it comes to the final preparations in Step 6 and the implementation of 0 hour in Step 7, little information is known to the public about the exact unfolding of events. This underlines the covert nature of the operation. However, the coordinated actions of seizing the palace and media outlets, arresting Bazoum and his associates, and making a timely announcement on state television suggest well-organized final preparations. Chiani and his forces' announcement on state television was calm, timely, and fitting. The speech suspended the constitution, closed the borders, and justified the coup as a matter of national importance for the good of the people and nation. Unfortunately, the coup does show some shortcomings when it comes to stabilizing the post-coup situation. On the one hand, the immediate post-coup situation was not brought under control effectively as demonstrations erupted in the capital Niamey, along with sanctions being imposed by ECOWAS and threatened military intervention. Furthermore, international condemnation did little to stabilize the situation. On the other hand, while Chiani did promise to return to civilian rule within 3 years, it remains to be seen if he follows through with his promises. The added factor of potential escalation creates significant pressure, complicating long-term stability. Overall, the coup in Niger correctly followed many of the steps outlined in a successful coup strategy, particularly in the initial planning and execution stages. However, the post-coup stabilization and long-term strategy face challenges to this day due to strong international reaction and internal unrest. 6.3 Sudan. Similarly to Niger, Sudan has a long history of coups, having experienced a staggering 30 coup attempts since its independence from Egypt and Great Britain in 1956. Sudan's latest coup occurred on April 15, 2023. However, this coup is not a typical one. It is the culmination of more than 30 years of Sudanese history. To understand why Sudan is currently in crisis after yet another coup attempt, it is essential to examine the country's long history of coups. Today's crisis can be traced back to the dictator Omar al-Bashir, who, on July 30, 1989, overthrew the democratic government in a military coup. Al-Bashir's rule was marked by repression, violence, economic instability, and near-constant civil war in the southern regions of Sudan, now independent South Sudan, and the western region of Darfur. Aware of Sudan's long history of coups, al-Bashir sought to secure his authority by coup-proofing, see Chapter 7.3, his regime. He accomplished this by forming various military and security agencies, ensuring none were strong enough alone to overthrow him. One of these agencies was the Rapid Support Forces RSF, created to counterbalance the regular Sudanese Armed Forces SAF. The paramilitary RSF is composed of various militias that operated during the Darfur conflict. The RSF is led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. In addition to being directly loyal to al-Bashir, the RSF also operates as a profitable business empire involved in gold mining, smuggling, and mercenary work, which made Hemedti a fortune. By 2005, the civil war in South Sudan had been raging for 22 years, resulting in the independence of South Sudan in 2011. However, this was far from ideal for al-Bashir, as most of Sudan's oil reserves were in South Sudan's territory. The standard of living dropped in the subsequent years as al-Bashir struggled to suppress escalating protests. Seeing the writing on the wall, the RSF, together with the SAF led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, removed al-Bashir from office on April 11, 2019, via a military coup. Upon al-Bashir's removal, Sudan entered a brief transition period with joint civilian and military rule. Both Hemedti and al-Burhan were leading figures in the temporary government, which was supposed to last until November 17, 2021. However, the RSF and SAF, not wanting to give up power, staged another military coup, removing civilian elements from the government. At this point, General al-Burhan of the SAF was effectively in charge, with RSF leader Hemedti as his number two. From that point, the relationship between Hemedti and al-Burhan began to deteriorate. One reason was al-Burhan's promise to transition back to civilian leadership if the RSF integrated into the SAF under his command. Hemedti opposed this proposal because the RSF also functioned as his business empire, which he would lose if it became part of the SAF. This all culminated on April 15, 2023, when the accumulation of more than 30 years of coups, dictatorships, and mismanagement led to Sudan's latest coup. Without these pre-existing conditions, this coup would not have been possible. According to the Middle East Eye, the coup began with approximately 2,000 RSF fighters en route through the capital Khartoum towards SAF headquarters, aiming to arrest and depose al-Burhan. At 8:50 a.m., the first RSF fighters attacked from 3 directions, targeting al-Burhan and killing 35 presidential guards. Al-Burhan barely escaped. Following this unsuccessful attempt, violent urban combat erupted in Khartoum and quickly spread to other parts of Sudan following SAF retaliation. Over the coming days and weeks, Hemedti's coup attempt devolved into a full-blown civil war between the RSF and SAF. As of now, the conflict remains unresolved, placing great strain on the civilian population and resulting in a humanitarian disaster as many have been forced to flee. Setting this coup against the 10-step list, it becomes apparent that while some areas were executed well, others were not, or only partially. Step 1 was executed perfectly. Sudan fits the criteria for being economically backward, politically independent, and having a centralized political structure. Step 2 starts to show some cracks. While Hemedti had extensive knowledge of the state apparatus, particularly the armed forces and bureaucracy, he did not fully understand the loyalty dynamics. Hemedti likely underestimated the loyalty of the SAF troops and their ability to retaliate against the RSF. This shortcoming led to the infiltration of the state apparatus being largely ignored. Furthermore, Hemedti never tried to neutralize or integrate potentially disloyal elements of the SAF into his forces. The planning stages of steps 4, 5, and 6 can also be seen as only partial successes. Important facilities were identified along with the location of key personalities such as Al-Burhan. However, during the final preparations, communication and coordination issues likely arose, given the swift and organized retaliation by the SAF. The active stage of the coup is where serious problems started to show. The attack at 0 hour was well coordinated with multiple teams hitting key targets simultaneously. However, the failure to secure Al-Burhan and fully neutralize loyalist forces meant that the coup did not achieve initial success. This, along with the RSF's inability to effectively control communication channels, allowed the SAF to quickly mount a response, preventing Hemedti's forces from establishing control over Khartoum or the broader state apparatus. Consequently, steps 9 and 10 were invalidated as the situation escalated into a full-blown civil war. In summary, Hemedti's coup had mixed success in the initial stages, but the coup ultimately failed due to critical shortcomings in execution, communication control, stabilization efforts, and long-term strategic planning. The failure to neutralize key loyalist figures and underestimating the loyalty within the SAF were significant flaws in the execution of the coup. 6.4. Myanmar. Myanmar has a complicated history with democracy. Since its independence from Great Britain, Myanmar has mostly been ruled by a military government. However, a long and difficult fight for democracy, led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, steadily managed to loosen the military's grasp on power. A major blow to the military government, also known as the Tatmadaw, came as Aung San Suu Kyi's Party for Democracy won the national elections by a landslide in November 2020, securing 83% of the seats in parliament. The Tatmadaw, who had never fully given up power, did not accept the results of the election. On February 1, 2021, under the leadership of General Min Aung Hlaing, they staged a military coup on the pretense of election fraud, removing the democratically elected and widely popular Aung San Suu Kyi. The coup began with the military blocking parliament from ratifying election results. They surrounded the building and arrested Aung San Suu Kyi along with other pro-democracy politicians, activists, and journalists. The military then declared a national emergency, suspending the constitution, setting up roadblocks, and halting all domestic and international flights, and suspending all television broadcasts, internet, and telephone services. Large demonstrations opposing the military junta sprung up all over the country, and over the following months, these demonstrations escalated, becoming increasingly violent. Protesters and police clashed regularly. In an attempt to quell the protests, the military imposed a curfew, along with frequent internet blackouts. Still, protests escalated to the point where soldiers and police regularly gunned down protesters in the thousands. To this day, the Tatmadaw face strong internal and external resistance, with demands for the release and reinstatement of Aung San Suu Kyi and a return to democracy. Adding fuel to the fire is the fact that the Tatmadaw has been accused of committing genocide against the Rohingya Muslims, an ethnic minority in Myanmar. The military's actions against the Rohingya people have been described as systematic and intended to eradicate the ethnic group, adding to the list of severe human rights abuses committed by the Tatmadaw. While the events that unfolded were tragic, the coup was a technical success. Step 1 was executed well. Myanmar has faced economic challenges and slow development, although less than the African examples of this paper. Furthermore, Myanmar is politically independent, with a highly centralized political structure and a history of military rule and coups. Steps 2, 3, and 4 were executed very well. The Tatmadaw has historically held significant power and influence, and therefore understands the state apparatus and its weaknesses better than anybody else. The Tatmadaw are also a prominent part in government, so are already deeply embedded inside the state apparatus and key facilities. Key personalities, including Aung San Suu Kyi and other leaders of the democracy movement, were identified and immediately detained. Other opposition figures were isolated and imprisoned to neutralize political resistance. The active stages of the coup were also planned and executed meticulously. Various elements of the military were positioned strategically to simultaneously take over important locations, such as the transportation hubs, TV stations, and government buildings. In so doing, the military ensured coordinated actions to achieve swift control. As transportation hubs were being seized, the state-run media was used to announce the coup and justify the military's actions. Following this, widespread internet and telephone blackouts were imposed to control information flow and prevent mobilization against the coup. Nevertheless, the strategy only prevented resistance from the public for a very short time. This is also where the coup ran into problems, with stabilization only partially successful. Although the military are largely in control, it is not without resistance. Their major misstep was underestimating the popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi. The large and violent protests are not conducive to short-term or long-term stability, and gunning down protesters simply should not happen. Such actions will forever leave a bitter taste with the population, making it very difficult to secure non-violent, long-term stability. Overall, however, the coup was executed well. The military effectively leveraged its historical influence, strategic planning, and control over the state apparatus to execute and maintain the coup. The approach taken by the Tatmadaw mostly aligns with the theoretical framework of staging a coup. But the long-term stability and the inability to quell protests represent significant shortcomings. Only time will reveal how severe this misjudgment was. 6.5 United States of America. Some do not consider the events that unfolded in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021 as a coup. But it can, in fact, be considered one, specifically a dissident coup. A dissident coup is carried out by a portion of the general population rather than a section of the government. A dissident coup should not be confused with a revolution, as it is still instigated by a person or group within the government. In the case of what occurred on January 6, 2021, on the one side there was the government, including police, the National Guard, and lawmakers. They were in the process of confirming President-elect Joe Biden as the 46th US president. On the other side, there were rioters who were all part of the MAGA, Make America Great Again, movement. Among these MAGA rioters were ordinary citizens, die-hard supporters of 45th US President Donald Trump, but also some hard-right extremist groups such as QAnon, the Proud Boys, and Oath Keepers. The main instigator was President Donald Trump, who propagated the lie that the 2020 US election had been stolen and that he should have rightfully won. On the morning of January 6, 2021, many of Trump's supporters arrived in Washington to listen to a speech that he was announced to give. Supporters numbered in the thousands, and a growing sentiment for violence emerged, further stoked by the far-right extremist groups on social media. At 12 p.m., Trump began his speech, further inciting the crowd by stating, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness." At 12:53 p.m., the crowd started moving towards the Capitol. At approximately 1 p.m., they gathered at the Capitol and overran the first set of barriers. Police and security forces were extremely stretched, and at 2:11 p.m., the first rioters overwhelmed police and broke into the Capitol building. The Capitol went into lockdown, and the Senate and House of Representatives discontinued their sessions. Over the next 4 hours, the rioters continued to overwhelm police, pushing further into the Capitol. In the process, they battled with police, looted, and destroyed government and private property. Lawmakers were forced to evacuate, and in the process, one of the rioters, Ashley Babbitt, was fatally shot while attempting to break into the Speaker's lobby. Trump and his close associates initially refused to condemn the actions of the rioters, referring to them as patriots standing up for their rights. Finally, around 4:17 p.m., Trump told the rioters to go home in a video message posted to Twitter while still expressing his support for them. A curfew was put into effect at 6 p.m., and both the House of Representatives and the Senate resumed their sessions. By approximately 3:40 a.m. on January 7th, outgoing Vice President Mike Pence officially certified Biden's victory, marking the end of this coup attempt. To this day, Trump repeats his lies about the election, while also spreading conspiracies and misinformation about the attack on the Capitol. Trump later faced several charges related to the incident on January 6th. On August 1, 2023, a grand jury indicted him in the District of Columbia U.S. District Court on 4 charges connected to his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election and the events leading up to the Capitol attack. Among the charges were conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstructing an official proceeding. Trump pleaded not guilty to all charges. This is possibly the worst attempt at a coup in modern history. The attempt was so unsuccessful that some people don't even consider it a coup attempt. Put against the 10-step list, the true scale of its mismanagement becomes very apparent. Firstly, the United States of America is not an ideal country to coup. While it does have a centralized political structure and is politically independent, the fact that it is not economically backward far outweighs the previous criteria. In fact, the US is one of the most powerful countries in the world, so the exact opposite of economically backward. Step 1 was therefore not fulfilled. Steps 2 and 3 are equally terrible, with there being no evidence of detailed study nor infiltration of the state apparatus. The rioters targeted the Capitol without a detailed strategy involving loyalty checks or detailed knowledge of state security beyond what was publicly known. Some individuals in the government supported the false election claims, but their numbers were so small that their influence couldn't have extended to a coordinated infiltration. The only points where this coup was somewhat within the 10-step system relates to steps 4 and 5. The Capitol was identified as a key facility and target. The rioters aimed to disrupt the verification of electoral votes by attacking this symbolic and functional heart of legislative power. Additionally, prominent personalities were also targeted. These included Vice President Mike Pence, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and other representatives. There were chats of "hang Mike Pence" and threats against Pelosi, but no systematic neutralization plan. Final preparations can best be described as unorganized. While there were some isolated attempts at coordinating an attack, these often led nowhere and were public on social media. There were no signs of precise 24-hour preparation as seen in traditional coups. While a minority of mostly far-right extremist rioters were somewhat organized, communicating with radios, walking around in marked gear and carrying weapons, this was the exception. With the gathering publicly pre-announced and heavily broadcasted, the coup attempt was notable for its lack of secrecy. This naturally makes the implementation of 0 hour in Step 7 difficult. Although the attack began after Trump's speech around noon, there was no coordinated simultaneous action by different teams, and the breach of the Capitol was chaotic. Steps 8, 9, and 10 hardly come to play, as the attempt to establish control over the Capitol was swiftly quelled by government forces once reinforcements arrived. In conclusion, the January 6th attack does not align well with the typical steps of a coup as outlined. None of the 10 steps for a successful coup were executed correctly. It was not planned with the precision, coordination, and infiltration characteristics of traditional coups. It lacked the systematic approach to key facilities, state apparatus, and post-coup stabilization. Instead, it appeared more as a chaotic and spontaneous insurrection driven by a mob rather than a strategically planned coup. Indeed, an argument could be made that this is not a coup because none of the steps were followed correctly. Instead, it could be classified as a riot. However, according to political scientist Scott Althaus, the term coup still fits better. He states, in contrast to Ryan's use of the word riot, the Klein Center definition of riot requires an element of spontaneity, and in this case, we did not categorize the events of January 6th as a riot, because there was clear evidence within at least some individuals and groups of planning, so that doesn't meet our definition for a riot. Further, he emphasizes that this does fit the definition of a coup, albeit a bad one, because of its goal to suddenly, violently, and illegally remove the incumbent executive authority of a national government. 7. Conclusion. No coup is perfect. In the 5 analyzed examples of recent coups, none of them fully executed the theoretical framework outlined in the 10-step list. Some were more successful than others, with Myanmar being the most successful, followed by Niger, Sudan, Russia, and the United States. However, a common theme of weakness tends to emerge by Step 8, and especially in steps 9 and 10. This is because coups, at their core, are inherently illegal and diametrically opposed the very freedom they often claim to be fighting for. While the technical aspects of a coup can be studied and perfected, the real challenge is not a complicated military operation, but rather getting the general population on board with it. Technology and social media especially empower citizens with unfettered access to information and a platform to voice dissent, making it increasingly difficult for coup plotters to restrict freedoms in the long run. In the future, it is my opinion that coups will become a more common occurrence, even in developed countries, but at the same time, these more frequent coups will be less successful and increasingly short-lived. Currently, the world stage is shrouded by mistrust, misguidance, and uncertainty. Uncertainty creates fear and mistrust among organizations, such as militaries, or the population at large. This could mean that there will be more dissident coups, as in the American example, short-lived yet impactful. It is important to remember that defining success for a coup is a complex undertaking. While some coups may achieve their initial goals of seizing power, this does not guarantee long-term stability or the well-being of the population. 7.1 Impacts and Consequences. A coup has wide-ranging consequences. This paper has examined some of these consequences in the analysis of recent coups. These consequences primarily affect the civilian population, causing both immediate suffering and long-term challenges. Humanitarian costs are the most apparent consequence of coups, costs which extend far beyond the immediate political upheaval. The immediate aftermath of a coup can be devastating for civilians. Violence often erupts as different factions vie for control, leading to casualties. In the chaos, basic services such as healthcare, water, and electricity are often disrupted. If the coup plotters fail to establish control, the subsequent breakdown of law and order results in increased crime, looting, and widespread fear among the population. This can lead to prolonged humanitarian crisis. The displacement of people is a common consequence, as they flee violence or persecution. Refugees strain neighboring countries, and the disruption can extend to entire regions. The coup in Sudan is a good example of this. A coup also brings economic instability. Political upheaval disrupts the stability of a nation and thereby also its economy. Impacts can be felt immediately after a coup as financial markets react quickly to political instability, with stock prices and currency values dropping, often leading to inflation. Foreign investments reduce drastically as trust in that country's government is lost within international circles. Furthermore, a country that has gone through a coup may also be excluded from trade organizations, as was the case with Niger's exclusion from ECOWAS. Sanctions by other nations put further strain on the often already frail economy of a couped country. In the long term, this only leads to increased poverty among the civilian population, further exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Together, economic strain and a humanitarian crisis are a vicious cycle that can destabilize entire regions. Strained diplomatic relations lead to increased militarization, humanitarian spillover impacts neighboring countries, and power vacuums allow violent extremist groups such as the Islamic State, ISIS, to wreak havoc worldwide. Syria is not among the countries analyzed in this paper, as Syria has not had a coup in recent years. It is still worth mentioning, though, as Syria is a great example of how coups and their ensuing conflicts can destabilize countries and entire regions. Historically, Syria has experienced 21 coups since 1945. The last successful coup occurred in 1970 when President Hafez al-Assad seized power in a military coup. Since then, Syria has faced continuous unrest, with tensions boiling over during the Arab Spring in 2011. The son of the previous dictator, President Bashir al-Assad, escalated the conflict further by violently suppressing protests and using weapons of mass destruction. This led to a complex civil and proxy war involving many parties, including the terrorist group ISIS. This conflict has and continues to cause widespread death and destruction, along with a humanitarian crisis that even reached Europe. One could even argue that the large influx of Syrian refugees into Europe is directly correlated with the recent rise of far-right populist politics in Europe. The example in Syria demonstrates how coups create a legacy of instability and conflict that can spill over borders, affecting regional and even global stability for decades. Syria is a good example of why preventing coups is a top priority for governments. 7.2. Preventative measures. All leaders, legitimate or not, must consider anti-coup measures for the good of themselves and their citizens. One of the most important measures is to maintain distinct and independent security, military, paramilitary, and civilian organizations. The goal is that no organization has a monopoly of force. Separate, sophisticated, and numerous security agencies also ensure that a coup conspiracy is swiftly identified and dismantled. The most effective preventative measure, however, may be nurturing a citizenry that cherishes its freedoms. A population that doesn't resist is a population whose needs are met. These needs go beyond basic necessities and revolve around the idea of freedom. A population that is free, or at least feels free, is more likely to be a population that resists the shackles of a coup. In this sense, promoting genuine freedom is perhaps the greatest deterrent to a coup's success. You've just heard How to Coup, a 2024 Matura paper written and narrated by Gabriel Ferguson, recording and voice enhancement provided by 11 Labs.